Sometimes the people we love most are the hardest to forgive. Sometimes we carry regrets so heavy they bend our backs and steal our sleep for decades. Silas Boone knew both truths when his estranged brother died and left him a worthless cave. In the Sierra Hills, he rode up there with his dog Dusty just to board it up and be done with family ghosts. But when Dusty ran into that dark cave and wouldn't come out, Silas had to follow. Inside, he found old letters and relics that revealed a secret his brother had kept for 40 years. The discovery would either destroy what little piece Silas had left, or finally set him free from a lifetime of pain. What was hidden in that cave that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pine branches like old memories, casting shadows across Silas Boone's weathered hands as he held the death certificate. The paper felt heavier than it should have, considering it contained so few words about a man who had lived 68 years on this earth. Natural causes, the document stated in sterile black ink, as if a broken heart could be classified so simply. Silas set the certificate on his kitchen table, next to the coffee cup that had grown cold, while he stared at those final official words about his brother Thomas. The lawyer had delivered the news 3 days ago, along with the inheritance papers that made Silas laugh, a bitter sound that startled even himself in the quiet of his cabin. After 40 years of silence, Thomas had left him the one thing nobody in the Boone family had ever wanted, that God-forsaken cave carved into the granite hillside above Willow Creek. "Just the cave, Mr. Boone," the lawyer had said, adjusting his spectacles. "No money, no property, no personal effects, just the mineral. Rights to that old hole in the ground." Silas had signed the papers without reading them carefully. What was the point? He knew that cave well enough, a damp, dark mouth in the mountainside that had been in their family since his grandfather's time. As children, he and Thomas had explored its shallow entrance on summer afternoons, their voices echoing off stone walls as they pretended to be prospectors or outlaws hiding from posses. But that was before everything changed, before harsh words and wounded pride built a wall between them that lasted 4 decades. Now, sitting in his kitchen with only the ticking of his father's old clock for company, Silas tried to remember the exact words that had torn them apart. It was something about the land, about their father's will, about who deserved what and who had worked harder for it. The details had faded, but the hurt remained sharp as a blade. He'd been 28 then, Thomas 25, both young enough to think their anger made them righteous and old enough to make it stick. A soft whine from the corner drew his attention to Dusty, his shepherd mix, who had been watching him with those knowing brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. Dusty was 8 years old now, grey creeping into his muzzle, but he still had the alert bearing of a dog who'd learned to read his master's moods like weather patterns. "No, boy," Silas said, reaching down to scratch behind Dusty's ears. "Been sitting here too long, haven't I?" Dusty had come to him as a half-starved pup, abandoned on the mountain road during a particularly harsh winter. Silas had found him nearly frozen, ribs showing through his thin coat, too weak to even whimper. Most folks might have taken him to the animal shelter in town, but Silas understood what it meant to be left behind, forgotten by those who should have cared. He'd nursed Dusty back to health with warm milk and patience, and the dog had repaid him with 8 years of unwavering loyalty. The irony wasn't lost on him that his most trusted companion was a creature he'd rescued from abandonment, while his own brother had died alone in a rented room above the hardware store in town. Mrs. Henderson from the post office had mentioned it when she'd handed him his mail 2 weeks ago, casual as commenting on the weather. Shame about Thomas Boone passing. Like that, with nobody around. Always seemed like a decent enough fellow, even if he kept to himself. Silas had nodded and said something appropriate, but inside his chest had tightened with a familiar ache. He'd driven past the hardware store twice that day, slowing his old pickup truck as he passed the upstairs windows, wondering what Thomas's final days had been like. Had he been in pain? Had he thought of their childhood, of the cave, of the brother he'd lost to stubbornness and time? The questions followed him home and settled into his bones like winter cold. Now, 3 days later, with the inheritance papers making it official, Silas knew he had to face that cave one more time. Not because he wanted anything from it, but because it was the last thread connecting him to Thomas, and he needed to cut it clean so he could finally let the past stay buried. He rose from his chair, joints protesting the movement. 65. Years of hard mountain living had left their mark on his frame. His reflection in the kitchen window showed a man carved by weather and work, beard more white than brown now, eyes the color of winter sky. He looked like his father, something that had both pleased and worried him in younger years. Would he die alone too, he wondered, like his father had, like Thomas had? Dusty followed him to the coat rack by the door, tail wagging slightly as he recognized the signs of an expedition. Silas pulled on his heavy wool jacket, the one Thomas had given him for his 30th birthday, back when they still spoke. The irony struck him again. Even his clothes carried ghosts. "Come on then," he said to Dusty. "Let's go see what Thomas left us besides regrets." The ride to the cave took 40 minutes on horseback, following the old deer trail that wound through pine and aspen groves toward the higher elevations. Silas rode his mare, Sally, a steady sorrel who'd been making this climb for 12 years, and knew the way by heart. Dusty trotted alongside, occasionally ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents before circling back to check on his companions. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the aspen leaves flickered, gold and amber in the afternoon sun. This was the kind of day that reminded Silas why he'd chosen mountain life over the complications of town living. Up here, a man could think clearly, could see the shape of his life without all the noise and hurry that seemed to plague folks. Down in the valleys, as they climbed higher, memories came unbidden. He and Thomas racing their horses up this same trail, whooping like wild Indians as they played at being mountain men. Thomas teaching him to read animal tracks in the mud by Willow Creek, the two of them sharing a can of peaches they'd borrowed from their mother's pantry, sitting on a fallen log and planning grand adventures that would take them to California or Alaska or anywhere that seemed impossibly far from the small world of their childhood. When had they stopped dreaming together? When had they started looking at each other with suspicion instead of affection? The cave entrance appeared around a bend in the trail, a dark slash in the granite face of the hillside. Silas had expected it to look smaller than he remembered. That was how childhood places usually appeared to grown eyes. But if anything, the opening seemed larger and more forbidding than it had 40 years ago. Pine needles and fallen leaves had accumulated around its mouth, and blackberry vines had grown wild across part of the entrance, giving it an abandoned, forgotten look. He dismounted and tied Sally's reins to a sturdy pine branch, then stood for a long moment studying the cave. It was maybe 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall at the entrance, carved naturally into the hillside by some ancient geological process. His grandfather had discovered it while hunting deer in 1889 and had used it occasionally as a shelter during bad weather. As far as Silas knew, no one in the family had paid it much attention since his own childhood explorations with Thomas. "Well, boy," he said to Dusty, "let's get this over with." He'd brought a hammer and some old boards from his workshop, thinking to nail them across the entrance and be done with it. The cave would be sealed, the past would stay buried, and he could ride home with one less ghost haunting his conscience. It seemed like a reasonable plan for a reasonable man. But as he approached the entrance, Dusty began to act strange. The dog's behavior started as simple curiosity, nose to the ground, tail wagging as he sniffed around the rock face. But within minutes, his posture changed. His ears pricked forward, his tail went still, and he began to whine in a way Silas had never heard before. It wasn't the whine of fear or pain, but something else entirely, urgency perhaps, or recognition. "What's got into you?" Silas asked. But Dusty wasn't listening. The dog had moved closer to the cave entrance and was sniffing the air with an intensity that made the hair on Silas's arms stand up. Then, without warning, Dusty bolted into the darkness of the cave. "Dusty!" Silas called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Dusty! Get back here!" But the dog was gone, swallowed by shadows. Silas could hear him moving deeper into the cave, his claws clicking on stone, but he wouldn't come when called. This wasn't like Dusty at all. He was an obedient dog, had been since puppyhood. Something had drawn him into that darkness, something powerful enough to override years of training and loyalty. Silas stood at the entrance, peering into the gloom and feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd never liked enclosed spaces. Not since a childhood accident in the root cellar of their family home had left him trapped in darkness for 6 hours before Thomas had found him. The memory of that fear, that sense of being buried alive, had kept him from exploring too deeply into the cave, even as a boy. But Dusty was in there somewhere, and Silas couldn't abandon him any more than he could have abandoned that half-frozen pup on the mountain road 8 years ago. He went back to his saddlebags and retrieved his flashlight, testing the beam against his palm. Strong and steady. He'd changed the batteries just last week. He also pulled out a coil of rope, thinking he might need it if Dusty had fallen into some hidden pit or gotten trapped in a narrow passage. "Dusty!" he called one more time. "Come on, boy! Let's go home!" But there was no response, except the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk riding the afternoon thermals. Silas took a deep breath, tasting the thin mountain air, and stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, and the familiar scent of stone and earth filled his nostrils. His flashlight beam played across rough granite walls that showed tool marks from some long-ago attempt at widening the natural passage. He remembered those marks from childhood. His grandfather's work, probably, back when the old man had still harbored dreams of finding gold or silver in these hills. The cave extended back farther than Silas remembered, the passage branching and turning in ways that seemed new to him. Had Thomas been here more recently? Had he explored deeper than they'd ever gone as children? "Dusty!" he called again, and this time he heard an answering bark from somewhere ahead and to the right. The sound echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Silas followed the sound, his flashlight beam revealing a passage that sloped gradually downward. The walls were damp with condensation, and his breath began to fog in the cooler air. He'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when he realized something that made his heart race. This cave was much larger than anyone in his family had ever suspected. The passage opened into a natural chamber about the size of a large room, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. And there, in the center of the space, was Dusty, not trapped or injured, but sitting calmly next to something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. Wooden crates, metal boxes, items covered by old canvas tarps. Someone had been using this cave as a storage place, and given the thick layer of dust on everything, they'd been doing it for a very long time. As Silas approached, his flashlight beam revealed more. Details that sent his mind reeling. The storage was organized, methodical. The wooden crates were stacked neatly, the metal boxes arranged by size. Everything was positioned well above the cave floor on makeshift shelves constructed from boards and stones, protecting the contents from any water that might collect during heavy rains. This wasn't the work of a casual explorer or a temporary shelter seeker. This was the work of someone who had visited this place regularly over many years, someone who had treated it with care and respect, someone like Thomas. Dusty looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, tail wagging slowly, as if to say, "I found it. I found what you needed to see." Silas's hands trembled as he reached for the nearest wooden crate. feeling the weight of 40 years of silence pressing down on him like the stone roof of the cave. Whatever secrets Thomas had been keeping, whatever truths had been hidden in this darkness, they were about to come to light. And somehow, Silas knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Silas's flashlight beam wavered as his hands shook, casting dancing shadows across the hidden storage chamber. The air down here smelled different than the entrance, not just of stone and earth, but of old wood, metal, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Time, perhaps, the accumulated weight of years and secrets. Dusty remained seated beside the nearest wooden crate, his leather collar dark with age and wear. That collar had been with him since puppyhood, a simple brown band that Silas had fashioned. From an old belt when store-bought options proved too expensive. Now, in the strange underground chamber, it seemed to catch what little light reflected off the cave walls. A familiar anchor in an increasingly unfamiliar situation. The memory came to him unbidden, finding Dusty as a pup, half frozen and abandoned on the mountain road during the worst blizzard in 20 years. It had been late February, the kind of night when sensible folks stayed indoors and only desperate men ventured out. Silas had been returning from town with supplies when his headlights caught a small, dark shape beside the road. At first, he'd thought it was debris blown by the wind, a fallen branch or discarded trash. But something made him stop, made him leave the warmth of his truck cab to investigate. The pup had been barely breathing, his ribs showing through matted fur, too weak even to lift his head when Silas knelt beside him. Someone had thrown him away like garbage, left him to die in the cold and snow. Silas had wrapped the pup in his own coat and driven home through the storm, knowing he was probably too late but unable to abandon the small life to the mountain winter. He'd spent that entire night feeding Dusty warm milk with an eyedropper, keeping him close to the wood stove, talking to him in the gentle voice he reserved for injured animals and broken things. "Come on, little fellow," he'd whispered that first. "Night, don't give up on me now. Sometimes we all need someone to find us." Dusty had survived, thrived, grown into the loyal companion who now sat waiting patiently in a hidden cave chamber, as if he understood the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The parallel wasn't lost on Silas. He'd rescued Dusty from abandonment, while his own brother died alone, forgotten, with no one to offer comfort or companionship in his final hours. The guilt of that realization settled in his chest like a stone. "What did you find, boy?" he whispered, approaching the wooden crate that had captured Dusty's attention. The crate was old, but sturdy, constructed from pine boards that had darkened with age. Iron clasps held the lid secure, though they showed signs of rust despite the cave's dry atmosphere. Someone had taken care to protect these contents from moisture and time. Silas set his flashlight on a nearby stone shelf, angling it to provide the best light, then worked at the clasps with fingers that seemed clumsy with nervousness. The metal protested, but eventually yielded with small, squeaking sounds that echoed in the chamber's silence. He lifted the lid and immediately understood why Dusty had been so insistent about entering the cave. The crate was filled with childhood memories. On top lay a photograph, not framed but carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the elements. Silas unwrapped it with trembling fingers, revealing an image that struck him like a physical blow. Two boys, maybe 8 and 11 years old, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles and dirt-smudged faces. They stood beside this very cave entrance, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders with the unconscious affection of siblings who hadn't yet learned to guard their hearts. He remembered the day the photograph was taken. Their father had bought a new camera, a miracle of modern technology in 1952, and their mother had insisted on commemorating their summer adventures. "Stand together, boys," she'd called. "Let me see those handsome faces." They'd been happy. That day, proud of their exploration of the cave, eager to show off their discovery to anyone who would listen. Beneath the photograph lay other treasures from their shared childhood. A carved wooden horse that Thomas had whittled for Silas's 10th birthday, painted blue and white with careful attention to detail. A collection of particularly interesting rocks they'd found during their mountain wanderings, quartz crystals, fool's gold, and a chunk of obsidian that had fascinated them with its black shine. A slingshot they'd crafted together from oak wood, and rubber bands tested against tin cans and eventually abandoned when their aim proved better suited to imagination than accuracy. Each item was a small time machine, carrying him back to days when the future seemed limitless and brotherhood was as natural as breathing. He lifted the wooden horse, feeling its familiar weight in his palm, remembering the Christmas morning when Thomas had presented it with shy pride. "I made it myself," 8-year-old Thomas had said. "Took me 3 weeks, but Pa helped with the hard parts." Silas had treasured that horse, carried it in his pocket during their adventures, slept with it under his pillow until he grew old enough to worry about such things being childish. When had he lost track of it? When had these precious memories been relegated to storage in a hidden cave? The answer came to him with painful clarity. The day of their father's funeral, when lawyers and family tensions had transformed grief into greed, when love had been overshadowed by questions of inheritance and worth. Their father's will had been simple enough. The land divided equally between his sons, with Thomas receiving the house and barn, Silas getting the timber rights and grazing areas. Fair enough on paper, but complicated by 40 years of different contributions, different sacrifices, different dreams. The argument had started small, a disagreement about who should handle the estate's debts, but grief and stress had a way of magnifying old wounds, and soon they were shouting about things that had nothing to do with money or property. Thomas accused Silas of abandoning the family ranch for his trapping lifestyle. Silas countered that Thomas had never appreciated the sacrifices he'd made to keep the operation profitable during hard times. Harsh words had led to harsher ones. Old resentment surfaced like poison from infected wounds. By the time cooler heads might have prevailed, too much damage had been done. They'd divided the property according to the will, but they'd also divided their hearts. And neither man had been willing to be the first to admit he'd been wrong. Now, kneeling in a cave with his brother's carefully preserved memories spread before him, Silas understood what Thomas had been trying to save. Not just objects, but the essence of their relationship before pride and pain had poisoned it. These weren't Thomas's childhood treasures. They were their shared childhood, the foundation of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. Deeper in the crate, he found more items that made his throat tighten with emotion. His old hunting knife, the first one their father had given him, which he'd thought lost during a camping trip decades ago. A leather-bound journal they'd shared one summer, taking turns writing about their adventures, complete with detailed maps of their favorite fishing spots and hunting trails. A compass their grandfather had given them, inscribed with True North in spidery handwriting. But it was the item at the bottom of the crate that broke his heart completely. A birthday card, handmade from brown paper and decorated with pressed wildflowers. On the front, in Thomas's careful childhood handwriting, "For the best brother in the world." Inside, a simple message: "Happy birthday, Silas. I hope we stay together forever. Your brother, Tommy." Silas had to stop reading, had to set the card aside as his vision blurred with tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. Tommy. No one had called Thomas by that nickname since childhood, but seeing it written in his brother's young hand brought back a flood of memories so vivid they seemed to overwhelm the present moment. Thomas had made that card for his 12th birthday, had spent hours collecting the perfect wildflowers and pressing them between the pages of their mother's heavy Bible. He'd been so excited to give it, so proud of his creation, and Silas had treasured it until the day he'd packed it away with other childish things in preparation for the serious business of growing up. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Thomas had rescued these memories from that long ago. Purge had saved them when Silas had been ready to discard them. While Silas had been moving forward, leaving childhood behind in his rush toward adulthood, Thomas had been quietly preserving the best parts of their shared past. Dusty moved closer, sensing his master's distress, and pressed his warm flank against Silas's leg. The contact grounded him, reminded him where he was and why he'd come here. He'd intended to board up this cave and forget it existed, but now he understood that forgetting wasn't possible. These memories, these carefully preserved tokens of love and brotherhood, deserved better than abandonment. He looked around the chamber with new eyes, noticing details that had escaped his first shocked examination. The makeshift shelves were constructed with care, designed to protect their contents from any potential water damage. The spacing between items allowed for air circulation. Someone had visited this place regularly, had maintained and organized this hidden repository with the devotion of a curator tending a precious collection. The storage wasn't random or hurried. It was systematic, methodical. Thomas had been coming here for years, maybe decades, adding to the collection, preserving pieces of their shared history that Silas had forgotten or discarded. But why hide it? Why keep these treasures secret instead of sharing them, using them as bridges across the chasm that had opened between them? The questions multiplied in his mind as he carefully repacked the wooden crate, treating each item with the reverence it deserved. There were other containers in the chamber, other secrets, waiting to be discovered. The leather collar around Dusty's neck caught his flashlight beam again, and he realized that his faithful companion had led him not just to hidden objects, but to hidden truths about the brother he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. Whatever else Thomas had stored in this cave, whatever other secrets these stone walls contained, Silas knew he had to see them all, not because he wanted to, but because he owed it to the memory of the boy who had carved him a wooden horse and pressed wildflowers into a birthday card with hands full of love and hope. The past wasn't buried after all. It was waiting in the darkness, carefully preserved and patiently kept, ready to tell its story to anyone willing to listen. The hand-carved wooden box sat atop the second crate like a sentinel, its smooth surface worn to a gentle patina by countless handlings over the years. And like the rough pine construction of the storage crates, this box showed the careful attention of someone who understood that certain treasures deserved special protection. The wood was cherry, aged to a deep reddish brown with dovetailed corners, that spoke of skill and patience in the crafting. Silas recognized it immediately. Thomas had made it in high school shop class, spending weeks perfecting the joints, sanding the surfaces smooth as silk, applying coat after coat of hand-rubbed finish until it gleamed like a jewel. Their father had praised the workmanship, had used it as an example when lecturing them about the value of taking pride in one's work. "See that box your brother made?" he'd said one evening as they sat around the kitchen table after supper. "That's what happens when a man commits himself to doing something right. No shortcuts, no settling for good enough. That box will outlast all of us." Now, 45 years later, their father's prediction seemed prophetic. The box had indeed outlasted him, had outlasted Thomas too, and here it sat in the darkness of a hidden cave, still protecting whatever treasures Thomas had deemed worthy of its care. Silas's hands trembled as he lifted the box from its perch. It was heavier than he remembered, dense with whatever contents Thomas had chosen to preserve within its depths. The lid was secured with a small brass latch, tarnished now but still functional. For a moment he hesitated, sensing that opening. This particular container would cross some invisible threshold from which there might be no return. Dusty whined softly, a sound that somehow conveyed both encouragement and understanding. The dog had positioned himself between Silas and the cave entrance, as if standing guard against retreat or interruption. His brown eyes reflected the flashlight beam, creating twin points of light in the chamber's darkness. The latch opened with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the cave's silence. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be their mother's old quilting fabric, lay a collection of items that made Silas's chest tighten with recognition and regret. On top was a photograph he'd never seen before. Thomas at maybe 16, standing beside their father in front of the family barn. But it wasn't the subjects that caught his attention. It was the careful way the photo had been mounted on heavy paper, with a note in Thomas's handwriting beneath. "Dad, teaching me to shoe horses." Summer of 61. Silas was in town that day, missed the lesson. The observation stung because it was true. Silas had been in town that day, more interested in impressing Sally Morrison at the ice cream parlor than learning practical skills from his father. He'd missed more than just the horseshoeing lesson. He'd missed the patient way their father explained each step, the pride in the old man's eyes as he watched his younger son master a new skill, the quiet satisfaction of work well done. How many such moments had Thomas documented? How many small betrayals of attention and priority had he noted and preserved? Beneath the photograph lay a small wooden horse, carved from the same cherrywood as the box itself. But this wasn't the blue and white painted horse from the first crate. This one was natural wood, polished smooth, showing tool marks that indicated a more mature hand than the one that had crafted its colourful predecessor. Thomas had continued carving horses, Silas realized, had continued the hobby they'd once shared, even after their estrangement had made such gifts impossible. The horse was beautiful in its simplicity, capturing the essence of movement in static wood. The head was turned slightly, as if the animal were looking back over its shoulder, and something about the posture reminded Silas of their father's old gelding, Rex, who had died the winter before their falling out. "He made this for you," Silas whispered to the empty air, understanding suddenly that Thomas had never stopped thinking of him, never stopped creating tokens of affection that would never be delivered. The realization was both comforting and devastating. Deeper in the box, he found his old hunting knife, not the first one their father had given him, but the second, the better one, the one he'd carried into adulthood and somehow lost during a camping trip in the early 70s. He'd searched for it for days, retracing his steps, sifting through leaves and undergrowth, mourning its loss because it had been a symbol of his father's trust in his growing maturity. Now he understood what had happened to it. Thomas must have found it, must have recognized it and kept it safe all these years, waiting for an opportunity to return it that never came. The blade was still sharp, the handle worn smooth by years of use, but it showed signs of recent maintenance. The metal was oiled, the leather wrapping on the handle had been carefully repaired with tiny, precise stitches. Thomas had been taking care of it, keeping it ready, perhaps hoping that someday they would reconcile, and he could return it with the casual words brothers might use. "Found this old thing of yours. Figured you might want it back." The weight of lost opportunities pressed down on Silas like the stone ceiling of the cave. How many times had Thomas driven past his cabin, knife in his pocket, working up the courage to stop? How many birthdays and Christmases had he spent hoping for some sign that the wall between them might be cracking? At the bottom of the box lay a collection of smaller items that painted a picture of Thomas's solitary life. A ticket stub from the county fair, dated 1987, with a note attached, "Saw." The millers there asked about Silas. They said he's doing well. A pressed flower, possibly from their mother's grave, since she'd always loved the wild roses that grew in the cemetery's older sections. A newspaper clipping about a particularly harsh winter with a section circled in red ink, "Local Trapper." Silas Boone reports excellent fur quality this season despite challenging conditions. Thomas had been keeping track of him, following his life from a distance, like a devoted fan following a favorite team's progress through newspaper box scores. The thought was both touching and heartbreaking. His brother reading about his successes and failures in the local paper, collecting scraps of information like a detective building a case file on a person of interest. But the most devastating item was tucked beneath everything else, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. A birthday card, store-bought this time, but signed in Thomas's careful adult handwriting. Happy 45th birthday, Silas. I think about you every day. I hope you're well and happy. I'm sorry for everything. Your brother, Thomas. The card was dated 15 years ago. Thomas had bought it, written the message, and then, what? Lost his nerve? Decided it was too little, too late. Chosen instead to add it to this collection of unexpressed feelings and undelivered gestures. Silas could picture him standing in the drugstore's card aisle, reading through options, selecting one that seemed appropriate for a brother he hadn't spoken to in decades. He could imagine Thomas sitting at his kitchen table, pen in hand, struggling to find words that might bridge 40 years of silence. The card represented hope and cowardice in equal measure, the hope that reconciliation was possible, the cowardice that prevented action. As he carefully repacked the wooden box, Silas felt the familiar anger that had sustained him through 4 decades of estrangement beginning to crack and shift. The anger had been easier than this, easier than understanding that Thomas had been as trapped by their silence as he had been, easier than realizing that pride had robbed them both of decades, of brotherhood they could never reclaim. Dusty moved closer, pressing his warm muzzle against Silas's hand. The contact was grounding, a reminder that loyalty and love didn't always require words, that sometimes the most profound connections were the ones that endured despite silence and separation. The cave held more secrets. He could see other containers, other carefully preserved collections waiting to be discovered. But already the weight of revelation was almost more than he could bear. Thomas hadn't forgotten him, hadn't stopped loving him, hadn't moved on with his life as Silas had always assumed. Instead, he'd been curating a museum of their brotherhood, preserving pieces of the past and hoping for a future that would never come. The metal box was different from the wooden containers, sleeker, more utilitarian, with a rubber gasket around the lid that spoke of serious weather protection. It was the kind of storage container a man might use for important documents, things that absolutely could not be allowed to deteriorate over time. The box itself was unremarkable, probably purchased at the hardware store in town, but its contents would prove to be anything but ordinary. Silas lifted it carefully, noting the weight distribution that suggested papers rather than objects. His hands, steadier now after the emotional upheaval of the wooden box discoveries, worked the latches with growing confidence. Whatever Thomas had preserved here, it was meant to last, meant to be found someday by someone who would understand its significance. The lid opened to reveal neat stacks of envelopes, bound with string and organized by what appeared to be dates written in pencil on small paper tabs. The top bundle was labeled 1965-1970, the bottom 2000-2005. 40 years of correspondence that had never been sent, 40 years of one-sided conversations with a brother who had no idea they were taking place. Silas lifted the first bundle, with the reverence he might have shown a religious artifact. The envelopes were addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting, Mr. Silas Boone, Rural Route 3, Cedar Ridge, Montana. The address had changed over the years. Silas had moved his cabin twice as timber and trapping opportunities shifted, but somehow Thomas had kept track, updating each batch of letters with current information as if he were maintaining a correspondence with a traveling friend. The first envelope was postmarked 1965, but never mailed. 2 years after their father's funeral, 2 years after the argument that had torn their family apart. Silas's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, unfolding paper that crackled with age. "Dear Silas," it began, "I've been thinking about what happened at Dad's funeral, about the things we both said. I can't sleep some nights going over it. All in my head, wishing I could take back the harsh words. You were right about some things. I was being selfish about the house, thinking only about my own plans and not considering what you might want or need." The letter continued for 3 pages, a careful examination of their argument from Thomas's perspective, an attempt to understand where things had gone wrong and how they might be repaired. It was the work of a thoughtful man, someone who had spent considerable time analyzing his own motivations and mistakes. I know you're angry with me, and maybe you have a right to be. But I keep thinking about when we were kids, about all those summers exploring the mountains, and I can't believe this is how our story ends. I'm not good with words like you always were, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I wanted you to know that I miss my brother. The signature was simple. Love, Thomas. Silas had to stop reading, had to set the letter aside as the full impact of the discovery settled over him. While he'd been nursing his anger and pride, Thomas had been writing letters, working through his own grief and regret, trying to find ways to bridge the gap between them. And he'd been doing it consistently, year after year, even when there was no response, no sign that reconciliation was possible. The second letter, dated 6 months later, was shorter, but no less heartfelt. Thomas wrote about the changing seasons, about improvements he'd made to the family house, about a deer he'd seen that reminded him of the one they'd tracked together as teenagers. Ordinary details of daily life, the kind of things one brother might share with another if they were still speaking. I drove past your place last week, one letter from 1967 read. Saw smoke coming from your chimney and felt relieved that you're still there, still making a living in the mountains like you always wanted. Mrs. Peterson at the post office mentioned you brought in some especially fine furs this season. I was, proud when I heard that. Proud that my brother is succeeding at something he loves. The letters continued through the decades, marking time with small observations and larger sorrows. Thomas wrote about their mother's death, about sitting alone at her funeral and wishing Silas had been there to share the grief. He wrote about his brief marriage to Mary Ellen Foster, a teacher from town, and later about their divorce when she decided she couldn't handle the isolation of mountain life. I thought about asking you to be my best man, one letter from 1975 revealed. Stood there in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing what I might say if I called you. But I lost my nerve, pride, I suppose, or maybe fear that you'd hang up on me. So I asked Jim Henderson instead, and he did fine. But all through the ceremony, I kept looking at the church doors, hoping you might show up anyway. The marriage had lasted 3 years. Thomas wrote about the loneliness after Mary Ellen left, about rattling around in the big house by himself, about wondering if he'd made different choices, whether things might have turned out better. I think about you when I'm working in Dad's old workshop, a letter from 1978 confided. Remember how he used to have us both help with projects, you holding one end of a board while I held the other? I still do that sometimes, hold my end and imagine you're there holding yours. Probably sounds foolish, but it makes the work less lonely. The middle years brought news of small triumphs and larger disappointments. Thomas had tried his hand at raising cattle, had lost money when beef prices crashed. He'd learned carpentry, had done well enough to buy better tools and take on bigger projects around the county. He joined the volunteer fire department, had helped fight the big wildfire in '84 that threatened the whole valley. Saw your cabin in the distance when we were fighting the fire on Copper Ridge, one letter reported. Couldn't tell if you were there or not, but I made sure our crew paid special attention to that area. Couldn't bear the thought of you losing your home, even if you'd never know I had anything to do with protecting it. The later letters grew more philosophical, more aware of time's passage and opportunities lost. Thomas wrote about their father's grave, about maintaining it and wondering if Silas ever visited. He wrote about aging, about aches and pains that reminded him daily that neither of them was getting any younger. I had a heart episode last month, a letter from 2003 revealed. Nothing too serious, the doctor says, but it got me thinking about mortality, about things left undone and unsaid. If something happens to me, I hope you'll understand why I never sent these letters. It wasn't because I didn't want to reach out to you. It was because I was afraid you didn't want to hear from me. The most recent letters showed Thomas's handwriting, becoming less steady, the paper sometimes marked with spots that might have been tears or merely the trembling of an aging hand. He wrote about watching Silas from a distance during their father's burial 20 years earlier, about how grey his brother's hair had become, about how much he regretted not approaching him that day. "I think about dying alone sometimes," one of the final letters admitted. "Not because I'm afraid of death itself, but because it means I'll never get the chance to make things right between us. I keep these letters as proof that I tried, in my own cowardly way. Maybe someday you'll find them and understand that I never stopped loving you, never stopped missing the brother I lost to pride and stubbornness." Dusty whined softly, sensing his master's emotional distress. The dog had remained patiently beside him throughout the reading, occasionally shifting position, but never leaving his post as guardian and witness to these revelations. The bundle of letters represented more than correspondence. It was a chronicle of a life lived in the shadow of regret, a 40-year conversation with a brother who had never known it was taking place. Thomas had aged alone, worked alone, faced his fears and failures alone, all while maintaining this secret connection to the family he'd lost. As Silas carefully retied the string around the letters, he realized that his understanding of the past 40 years had been fundamentally wrong. He'd assumed Thomas had moved on, had built a life that didn't include memories of their brotherhood. Instead, Thomas had been trapped in the same web of regret and longing, writing letters he couldn't send, preserving memories he couldn't share, loving a brother who had convinced himself that love no longer existed. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. Somewhere in town, Thomas had died alone in his rented room, surrounded by silence and regret, never knowing that these letters might have changed everything if only he'd found the courage to send them. But courage, Silas was beginning to understand, was more complicated than he'd ever realized. Sometimes it took more courage to remain silent than to speak, more strength to preserve hope than to abandon it. The cave system extended deeper than Silas had ever imagined, and his flashlight beam revealed passages branching off in directions that defied his childhood memories. What he'd always thought of as a simple shelter had been transformed by decades of his brother's exploration into something resembling an underground maze of interconnected chambers. The air grew cooler as he ventured deeper, following marks on the stone walls that Thomas had made to guide future visits. Dusty led the way with confidence that suggested he'd been this deep before, perhaps during his mysterious bolt into the darkness that had started this entire discovery. The dog's behavior remained alert but calm, as if he understood the significance of their journey and was determined to see it through to its conclusion. In the third chamber, larger than the previous, Silas found evidence of more recent and personal storage. This wasn't childhood memorabilia or unsent letters. This was the repository for items from their father's life, things that should have been divided between the sons but had instead been quietly preserved by one brother while the other remained. Unaware of their existence, the centerpiece of the collection was their father's gold pocket watch, displayed on a small wooden stand that Thomas had obviously crafted specifically for this purpose. The watch caught Silas's flashlight beam and threw it back in warm, golden reflections that seemed almost alive in the underground darkness. He remembered that watch from his childhood, his father consulting it during long days of ranch work, winding it carefully each evening before bed, treating it with the respect due a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations. Silas lifted the watch with reverent hands, feeling its familiar weight, reading the inscription on its back that he'd memorized as a boy. "To Samuel Boone, with love and faith, Margaret Boone, Christmas 1943. Their parents' names, inscribed during the early days of their marriage, back when their father was still young and their mother still believed the war would end soon and bring him safely home. The watch was in perfect working condition. Someone had been maintaining it, keeping it wound, perhaps even having it serviced by the jeweler in town when necessary. The hands showed the correct time, the crystal was free of scratches, and the gold chain showed signs of recent polishing. Thomas had been taking care of it as faithfully as if their father were still alive to appreciate the attention. Beside the watchstand sat a manila folder, thick with documents that revealed the full scope of Thomas's secret stewardship. Legal papers, property deeds, tax records, insurance policies, all the paperwork that should have been handled jointly by both brothers, but had instead fallen entirely to Thomas, when Silas had walked away from family responsibilities in his anger and hurt. The property tax receipts told a particularly damning story. For 40 years, Thomas had been paying not just his own share, but Silas's portion as well, ensuring that the family land remained intact despite the legal division mandated by their father's will. The amounts weren't large by modern standards, but for a man living alone on a carpenter's income, they represented genuine sacrifice. Property taxes paid in full for lots 7 and 8, Cedar Ridge Township, read one receipt from 1987, paid by Thomas Boone on behalf of his estate. Lot 8 was Silas's parcel, the one he'd inherited but abandoned in his haste to establish independence from family obligations. For 25 years, he'd assumed the county was simply overlooking the remote acreage, never realizing his brother was quietly protecting his inheritance. Even more revealing were the business letters from various development companies dating back to the early 1980s. Real estate speculators had been trying to buy portions of the Boone family land for decades, offering increasingly attractive sums for what they described as prime development opportunities in the expanding Cedar Ridge Recreation Corridor. The letters showed a pattern of patient, polite refusal from Thomas, explaining that the land wasn't entirely his to sell, that his brother held an equal interest and would need to be consulted before any decisions could be made. When the developers suggested they might approach Silas directly, Thomas had discouraged them, claiming his brother was difficult to reach and not interested in development opportunities at this time. In effect, Thomas had been serving as an unofficial guardian of Silas's property interests, protecting him from pressure he didn't even know existed. Some of the later offers were substantial enough to represent life-changing money for either brother, but Thomas had turned them all down rather than risk selling land that belonged partially to someone who wasn't available to consent to the transaction. Mr. Boone, read one letter from 1995, "We're prepared to offer $50,000 for the mineral rights to lots 7 and 8, plus an additional $25,000 if you can guarantee clear title without the complications you mentioned regarding your brother's interest. This offer represents a significant premium over current market values for comparable properties." Thomas's handwritten response, carbon-copied and filed with the original letter, was characteristically diplomatic. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your generous offer, but as I've explained previously, any disposition of these mineral rights would require my brother's consent, which I am not in a position to obtain at this time. The property will remain in family hands for the foreseeable future." Silas had to sit down on a natural stone ledge, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was reading. While he'd been living his independent life in the mountains, trapping and hunting and congratulating himself on his self-reliance, Thomas had been quietly managing a complex web of family financial responsibilities that Silas had completely abandoned. The medical bills in the folder painted an even more poignant picture. Thomas had been dealing with serious health issues for at least the past 5 years. Heart problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, conditions that required expensive medication and regular doctor visits. His insurance had been adequate but not comprehensive, leaving him responsible for significant out-of-pocket expenses that would have strained any fixed income. Yet even during his illness, even when money must have been desperately tight, he'd continued paying the property taxes on Silas's land. The most recent receipt was dated just 3 months before Thomas's death, with a notation in shaky handwriting, "Paid in full despite Dr. Morrison's bills. S's land secure for another year." Dusty had positioned himself near the chamber entrance. as if standing guard while Silas absorbed these revelations. The dog's presence was both comforting and accusatory, a reminder that loyalty and devotion were choices that some creatures made, regardless of whether such dedication was acknowledged or reciprocated. At the bottom of the document folder, Silas found something that made his hands shake with anger and regret. It was a copy of their father's will, but not the version he remembered from the lawyer's office 40 years ago. This was an earlier draft, dated 6 months before their father's death, with handwritten notes in the margins that showed his true intentions. The original will had left everything to both sons equally, but with a crucial addition that the lawyers had somehow failed to mention during the reading: a detailed letter explaining their father's hopes that his sons would work together to preserve the family legacy, that they would support each other through difficult times, and that they would never allow pride or stubbornness to divide them, as it had divided him from his own brother decades earlier. "I've seen what family feuds can do," their father had written in his careful script. "I've watched brothers become strangers over matters that seemed important at the time but proved meaningless in the long run. My greatest hope is that my sons will be wiser than I was, that they'll choose love over pride, understanding over stubbornness, forgiveness over resentment." The letter went on to detail specific hopes and expectations: that Thomas would help Silas with business matters if his trapping career proved insufficient, that Silas would help Thomas with the physical demands of ranch work as they both grew older, that they would make decisions about the property together and share both the burdens and benefits of inheritance. "This land has been in our family for 3 generations, the letter concluded. "It represents not just financial security, but continuity, legacy, and the hopes of ancestors who worked hard to give their descendants something lasting. I trust my sons to honor that legacy by honoring each other." Silas folded the letter carefully, his vision blurred by tears of rage and sorrow. Their father had tried to prevent exactly what had happened, had left detailed instructions for avoiding the kind of rift that had ultimately destroyed his family. But neither son had ever seen the letter, had never known that their destructive argument was precisely what their father had most feared. Someone, the lawyers probably, concerned more with efficient estate processing than family harmony, had decided the letter was unnecessary, had focused on the legal distribution of assets while ignoring the emotional wisdom that might have saved 2 brothers from 40 years of pointless estrangement. As he carefully returned the documents to their folder, Silas understood that his discovery of the cave's secrets was more than just an exploration of the past. It was an education in love, sacrifice, and the devastating cost of pride. Thomas hadn't just preserved family memorabilia, he'd preserved the family itself, shouldering responsibilities and protecting interests that Silas had abandoned without a second thought. The gold pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking time with the same precision it had shown throughout 3 generations of Boone family history. But time, he was learning, was both infinite and desperately finite, capable of preserving love across decades of silence while simultaneously making reconciliation impossible through the simple mechanism of death. His father's watch had outlasted his father, and now it had outlasted Thomas as well. Soon, if patterns held, it would outlast Silas too, another family heirloom passed down to no one, another symbol of continuity made meaningless by the failure of those who should have preserved not just objects, but relationships. The hand drawn map was tucked between 2 pieces of cardboard, protected like a precious document, which in many ways it was. Thomas had sketched it on heavy paper with the careful attention of a surveyor, using different colored pencils to indicate various features: blue for water sources, green for passages that led to the surface, red for areas that required caution, and yellow for what appeared to be his most significant discoveries. The map showed the cave system in remarkable detail, revealing chambers and passages that Silas had never suspected existed. What had seemed like a simple granite cave to childhood eyes was actually a complex network of interconnected spaces, some natural, some clearly modified by human hands decades or perhaps centuries earlier. Thomas had been exploring this underground world systematically, methodically, with the patience of a scholar and the precision of an engineer. At the center of the map, marked with a distinctive yellow star and the notation, "For Silas," written in Thomas's careful handwriting, was a chamber that appeared to be deeper in the system than anything Silas had yet discovered. The path to reach it was marked with careful directions. Follow main passage past the 3-rock marker, turn right at the water sound, descend carefully for 50 feet, watch for loose stones near the narrow section. Dusty studied the map alongside. His master, almost as if he could read the symbols and understand their significance. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly purposeful as they'd ventured deeper into the cave system, and now he moved toward the passage Thomas had marked on the map with a confidence that suggested familiarity. "You've been down there before, haven't you, boy?" Silas asked softly. Somehow you knew about all this. The dog's response was a soft whine and a movement toward the indicated passage, as clear an invitation as any human might have extended. As Silas prepared to follow the map's directions, memories of childhood cave exploration flooded back to him. He and Thomas had spent countless summer afternoons investigating the cave's shallow reaches, armed with flashlights and the fearless curiosity of youth. They'd made up elaborate stories about the cave's history, imagining it as a hideout for desperados or a secret meeting place for gold prospectors. "Maybe there's treasure hidden back there," 8-year-old Thomas had suggested during one of their adventures. "Maybe that's why Grandpa never talked much about finding this place." "Don't be silly," 12-year-old Silas had replied with the superiority of age. "If there was treasure, Grandpa would have found it by now. It's just a cave." Now, following his brother's carefully drawn map 45 years later, Silas wondered if young Thomas might have been more prescient than either of them had realized. Not treasure in the conventional sense, perhaps, but something valuable enough that Thomas had spent decades protecting it, mapping it, preparing for the day when someone else might need to understand its significance. The passage narrowed considerably as they descended, requiring Silas to duck his head and occasionally turn sideways to navigate the tighter sections. His flashlight beam revealed tool marks on some of the walls, evidence of deliberate widening in places where the natural stone had been too restrictive for comfortable passage. Someone had worked to make this route accessible, and given the age of the tool marks, that someone was likely their grandfather, or perhaps even earlier generations of the Boone family. The water sound mentioned on the map proved to be a small, underground stream, barely more than a trickle, flowing along one wall of the passage and disappearing into cracks in the stone floor. The sound was soothing in the underground silence, a gentle reminder that life and movement continued even in the heart of the mountain. Following the map's directions, Silas turned right where the stream sound was loudest and began the careful descent Thomas had marked with warnings about loose stones. The footing was indeed treacherous in places, with gravel and small rocks that shifted underfoot and threatened to send an unwary explorer tumbling into the darkness below. Dusty navigated the descent with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, occasionally looking back to ensure Silas was managing the challenging terrain. The dog's obvious familiarity with the route confirmed Silas's growing suspicion that this exploration was less discovery than revelation, uncovering things that had been carefully prepared for his eventual finding. The narrow section mentioned on the map required Silas to remove his heavy coat and squeeze through sideways. His flashlight held ahead of him as he inched through a gap in the stone that seemed barely wide enough for human passage. For a moment, his old fear of enclosed spaces threatened to overwhelm him, but the thought of Thomas making this same difficult journey, probably multiple times, and certainly while dealing with the health problems documented in those medical bills, gave him the courage to continue. Emerging from the narrow section into a larger space, Silas found himself in a chamber unlike anything he'd seen in the cave system so far. This wasn't a natural formation. It was clearly the result of deliberate excavation, with walls that showed the systematic removal of stone and a ceiling reinforced with wooden beams that, while aged, appeared structurally sound. The chamber was roughly rectangular, perhaps 15 feet wide by 20 feet long, with a ceiling high enough that Silas could stand upright without concern. Along the walls, Thomas had constructed shelving, using the same careful craftsmanship that had characterized all his storage solutions. But the items displayed here were different from the previous chamber's contents. These weren't family memorabilia or personal documents. These were the tools and artifacts of serious mining activity. Hand-forged picks and shovels, oil lamps designed for underground use, wooden buckets reinforced with iron bands, and coils of rope that showed signs of regular use in challenging conditions. In the center of the chamber, positioned like an altar or display case, was a collection of rocks and mineral samples that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. Even with his limited knowledge of geology, he could recognize the telltale gleam of precious metals, silver ore by the look of it, in quantities and concentrations that spoke of serious potential value. Thomas hadn't just been preserving family history in this cave, he'd been protecting what appeared to be an active mining claim. The chamber they stood in wasn't just storage space. It was the entrance to what might be a significant silver deposit that their family had apparently known about for generations. A wooden sign, hand-carved with the same attention to detail that had characterized Thomas's other work, was mounted on the far wall. It read, "Boone Family Mine, established 1889, claimed by Samuel Boone III, preserved by Thomas Boone, saved for Silas Boone." The implications were staggering. The worthless cave that had been the only item in Thomas's inheritance wasn't worthless at all. It was potentially worth more than any other single asset the family had ever owned. And Thomas had known about it, had been protecting it, had been saving it for the brother who had spent 40 years refusing to speak to him. The map in his hands suddenly made perfect sense. Thomas hadn't been exploring the cave system out of idle curiosity. He'd been documenting a mining operation that their grandfather had started and that subsequent generations had continued in secret. The careful notations, the detailed passages, the warnings about dangerous areas, all of it was the work of someone preparing to pass along knowledge that would be needed for safe and productive mining operations. But why the secrecy? Why hide the mine's existence instead of celebrating the family's good fortune? The answer came to him as he studied the mineral samples more carefully. This wasn't just any silver deposit. Given the quality and concentration of the ore, it was potentially worth millions of dollars in current market conditions. That kind of wealth attracted attention, and attention brought complications that a family living simply in the mountains might want to avoid. The development offers that Thomas had been refusing suddenly took on a different character. The companies hadn't been interested in building vacation homes or tourist facilities. They'd been trying to gain access to mineral deposits they suspected existed in the area. Thomas's polite but firm refusals hadn't just been protecting surface land. They'd been protecting one of the most valuable silver deposits in the region. Dusty had positioned himself near what appeared to be the entrance to another passage, this one leading deeper into the mountain, where the actual mining activities had presumably taken place. The dog's patient waiting seemed to suggest that their exploration wasn't complete, that Thomas had more secrets to reveal in the depths of the mountain. As Silas carefully folded the map and prepared to continue following his brother's carefully documented trail, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his inheritance, his family, and his relationship with Thomas was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt. The worthless cave was actually a treasure vault. The brother he'd dismissed as unambitious was actually the protector of a fortune. The land he'd abandoned was actually some of the most valuable property in the region. Thomas hadn't just been preserving memories and paying taxes. He'd been serving as the guardian of a family legacy worth more than Silas had ever imagined possible. And he'd been doing it alone, in secret, for 40 years, waiting for the day when his estranged brother might return to claim his birthright. The deed to the silver mine was housed in a waterproof document case, the kind banks used for their most important papers. Unlike the other items Thomas had stored in the cave, this container showed signs of recent handling. The latches were well oiled, the seals intact, and the interior completely dry despite decades in the mountain's depths. Thomas had been accessing this particular secret regularly, perhaps checking on it, perhaps updating the documents as circumstances changed. Silas opened the case with trembling fingers, already suspecting that whatever he found inside would fundamentally alter his understanding of not just his inheritance, but his entire relationship with his brother and their family's history. The first document was exactly what he'd expected and feared to find. An official mining claim filed with the territorial government of Montana in 1889 and regularly renewed every decade since. Be it known that Samuel Boone I, having discovered valuable mineral deposits on the land described herein, does hereby claim mining rights in perpetuity for himself and his heirs. The original document read in the formal language of the 19th century. Said claim encompasses approximately 40 acres of mineral rights, extending from the natural cave formation on the southeast face of Cedar Ridge, down to a depth of 500 feet below the surface elevation. But it was the subsequent documents that revealed the full scope of what Thomas had been protecting. Geological surveys, conducted in secret and at considerable expense over the decades, confirmed that the Boone family mine contained one of the richest silver veins ever discovered. In western Montana, conservative estimates, based on core samples and mineral analysis, suggested the mine contained enough high-grade ore to be worth somewhere between $5 and $10 million at current market prices. $5 to $10 million. The number hit Silas like a physical blow. He had to sit down on a wooden crate, his legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. Thomas hadn't just been protecting family memorabilia or paying property taxes. He'd been guarding a fortune that would have made both brothers wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But why keep it secret? Why live in poverty while sitting on a treasure that could have solved every financial problem either of them had ever faced? The answer came in the form of a thick folder labeled Development Pressure in Thomas's careful handwriting. Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, and legal documents that painted a picture of increasingly aggressive attempts by outside interests to gain access to the Boone family land. The letters weren't just the polite inquiries Silas had seen. Earlier, these were from major mining corporations, development companies, and even government agencies that had somehow learned about the potential value of the property. The tone of the correspondence grew more insistent over the years, with offers escalating from thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and finally to threats of eminent domain proceedings if the family wouldn't cooperate with development initiatives in the public interest. Mr. Boone read a letter from 1998 on the letterhead of Consolidated Mining Enterprises. Our geological consultants have identified your property as containing mineral deposits of significant commercial value. We are prepared to offer you $500,000 for complete mineral rights, plus a 5% royalty on all extracted materials. This represents fair market value, plus a substantial premium for your cooperation in expediting the development process. Thomas's handwritten response, carbon-copied and filed with the original letter, was diplomatically firm. Gentlemen, I appreciate your interest in our family property, but as I have explained in previous correspondence, any disposition of mineral rights would require the consent of my brother, who is currently unavailable for such discussions. The property will remain in family hands. The letters grew more threatening as the years passed. Legal firms representing unnamed clients began questioning the validity of the original mining claim. County officials suggested that unpaid property taxes, which Thomas had actually been paying faithfully, might result in foreclosure proceedings. Environmental groups, clearly funded by outside interests, claimed the family's presence on the land was preventing important ecological surveys. Most disturbing were the photographs Thomas had taken documenting trespassers on the family property. People who were obviously not casual hikers or hunters, but professional surveyors with expensive equipment, taking unauthorized measurements and soil samples. Some photos showed drilling equipment that had been brought onto the land illegally, evidence that outside interests were conducting their own geological assessments without permission. "They're getting bolder," Thomas had written in a journal entry dated just 2 years before his death. "Found evidence of core drilling near the upper meadow yesterday. They know what's down there, and they're not going to give up. I can't protect this forever by myself, but I can't reach out to Silas without risking everything we've worked to preserve." The journal entries revealed the full burden Thomas had been carrying. He'd been playing a delicate game for decades, protecting the mine's secrecy while fending off increasingly sophisticated attempts to force the family into selling or surrendering their rights. He'd used legal delays, bureaucratic procedures, and carefully worded correspondence to buy time, but the pressure had been mounting steadily. "Had another visit from those consolidated mining people today," one entry read. "They're offering $2 million now, plus royalties. Part of me wonders if Silas would want me to take it. $2 million would set us both up for life. But once they get control of the land, they'll strip mine everything. Dad would roll over in his grave if I let them destroy the mountain for silver." The final revelation came in the form of a sealed envelope marked "For Silas, Final Instructions." Inside was a document that Thomas had clearly been working on right up until his death, a comprehensive guide to managing the mine safely and profitably while maintaining the secrecy that had protected it for over a century. "Brother," the document began, "if you're reading this, then I'm dead and you found the cave system like I always hoped you would. I know you're probably angry with me for keeping all this secret, but I want you to understand why it was necessary." The explanation that followed was methodical, thorough, and heartbreaking in its attention to detail. Thomas had consulted with lawyers, mining engineers, and financial advisors over the years, always using intermediaries to protect the family's anonymity. He'd developed plans for extracting the silver responsibly, in small quantities that wouldn't attract attention, generating steady income while preserving the mine for future generations. "The mine could make us both wealthy," Thomas had written, "but wealth attracts the kind of attention that destroys families and communities. I've seen what happens to people who strike it rich. They become targets for every schemer and criminal in the territory. I didn't want that for us." Instead, Thomas had envisioned a careful, long-term approach, extracting just enough silver to provide comfortable living for both brothers, using the profits to improve their properties and perhaps help other families in the area, but never revealing the full extent of the mine's value. "I kept thinking you'd come back someday," the document continued. "I kept hoping we'd work it out, that I could show you what Grandpa left us and we could figure out together how to handle it responsibly. I never imagined I'd die before that happened." The most devastating part of the document was Thomas's explanation of why he'd never simply written to Silas about the mine's existence. Several times over the decades, he'd drafted letters revealing the secret, but each time he'd decided against sending them. "How could I contact you after 40 years of silence just to tell you we were rich?" Thomas had written. "You would have thought I was trying to buy your forgiveness, that I was only reaching out because of the money. Our relationship was worth more to me than any amount of silver, So Thomas had waited, and hoped, and protected, and died alone, still believing that someday his brother would return and they would reconcile naturally, without the complication of wealth driving their reunion. The irony was almost unbearable. Thomas had been living in poverty while guarding a fortune, had died alone while dreaming of reconciliation, had spent 40 years protecting Silas's inheritance, while Silas remained completely unaware of the sacrifice being made on his behalf. Dusty whined softly, sensing his master's emotional state as the full weight of the revelation settled over him. The dog moved closer, offering the silent comfort of his presence as Silas struggled to process what he'd learned. The worthless cave that had been the only item in Thomas's will was actually the entrance to one of the most valuable silver mines in Montana. The brother he'd dismissed as unambitious and uninteresting had actually been one of the most dedicated and sacrificial men he'd ever known. The 40 years he'd spent nursing his anger and pride had been 40 years, during which Thomas had been working tirelessly to protect Silas's future. As he carefully repacked the mining documents, Silas realized that every assumption he'd made about his brother, his family, and his own life had been fundamentally wrong. Thomas hadn't abandoned him or forgotten him. Thomas had been the guardian angel he'd never known he needed, protecting interests he'd never known he had, preserving a legacy he'd never known existed. The revelation was simultaneously liberating and devastating. He was wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but the brother who had made that wealth possible was dead. He had inherited a fortune, but he had also inherited a burden of regret so massive it threatened to crush whatever happiness the money might have brought. In the silence of the mine chamber, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's decades-long devotion, Silas finally understood the true cost of pride and the devastating price of silence between people who love each other. The final letter was different from all the others. Newer paper, different handwriting, the shaky script of a man whose hands had begun to betray him in his final weeks. It was sealed in an envelope marked simply Silas, in letters that showed the tremor of illness and the weight of approaching mortality. This wasn't part of the decades-long collection of unsent correspondence. This was Thomas's final message, written with the knowledge that death was coming and that time for reconciliation was running out. Silas held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, knowing instinctively that whatever words Thomas had chosen for his farewell would either complete his transformation or destroy what little peace he'd managed to maintain through 65 years of hard mountain living. Dusty sat beside him in the underground chamber, patient as always, but somehow more alert, as if he too understood that they were approaching the heart of the mystery that had drawn them into the cave's depths. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Thomas's death. The handwriting was careful but labored, each word obviously chosen with deliberation and written with considerable effort. "My dear brother Silas," it began, "I'm writing this because Dr. Morrison says I don't have much time left, and I can't face the thought of dying with so many things unsaid between us. I know you probably won't read this until after I'm gone, but I need you to understand some things before I leave this world." The opening alone was enough to make Silas's hands shake, but he forced himself to continue reading, knowing that Thomas deserved to have his final words heard, even if they came too late to change anything between them. "I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for a single day in 40 years. I know that probably sounds impossible, given how we parted and how long we stayed apart, but it's the truth. Every decision I made, every choice I faced, I always wondered what you would do, what you would want, what would be best for both of us." The letter went on to explain Thomas's perspective on their long estrangement, but without the defensiveness or anger that might have characterized such a discussion between living brothers. Instead, Thomas wrote with the clarity that sometimes comes to people facing death, when pride and fear no longer seem as important as truth and love. "I know you, Blamed me for being greedy about Dad's will, about wanting to keep the house and the good land for myself. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of not being able to manage the ranch by myself, scared that if you took your share and left, I'd never see you again. I handled it badly, said things I didn't mean, let my fear turn into anger that hurt you when hurting you was the last thing I ever wanted to do. The admission was devastating in its honesty. Thomas had been 25 years old when their father died, suddenly responsible for a ranch operation that had always been run by two men working together. His insistence on keeping certain portions of the inheritance hadn't been greed, it had been terror at the prospect of facing that responsibility alone. I should have asked you to stay and work the ranch together, the letter continued. I should have told you how scared I was, how much I needed your help and your partnership. Instead, I acted like I didn't need anyone, like I could handle everything myself. Pride made me push away the one person I needed most. Silas had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the recognition of his own mistakes reflected in his brother's words. He too had been operating from fear and pride, too concerned with proving his independence to consider that Thomas might have needed him to stay, might have been asking for help in the only way he knew how. The mine was another complication I didn't know how to handle, Thomas wrote. Dad had told me about it just before he died, swore me to secrecy, said it was our family's insurance policy, but that it needed to be managed carefully. Too much attention, too fast, and we'd lose control of everything. I was supposed to tell you about it after things settled down from the funeral, supposed to bring you in as a partner like Dad intended, the revelation that their father had planned. To include both sons in managing the mine's secret made Silas's chest tighten with fresh grief. Their father had trusted Thomas with the responsibility of bringing Silas into the family's most important secret, but their argument and estrangement had made that trust impossible to honor. After we stopped speaking, I didn't know what to do, the letter continued. How could I contact you about the mine without it looking like I was trying to buy you back? How could I explain that I'd been keeping this secret from you for years? So I just kept protecting it, kept waiting for the right time, kept hoping you'd come back on your own so we could work it out naturally. The letter detailed Thomas's decades-long struggle with increasing pressure from mining companies and developers, explaining how he'd used legal delaying tactics and careful misdirection to protect the family's secret, while hoping for reconciliation that would allow him to share the burden. I've been so tired, Silas, Thomas wrote. Tired of carrying all this alone, tired of making decisions that affect both of us without being able to talk to you about them. I've tried to do what Dad would have wanted, what you would have wanted, if you'd known the whole situation, but I'm not sure I've always made the right choices. The vulnerability in those words was almost unbearable. Thomas had been shouldering massive responsibilities alone for 40 years, making decisions that affected millions of dollars and their family's future, all while believing he was protecting a brother who didn't even know protection was needed. I need you to know that I've been watching over you all these years, the letter revealed. Not spying, not intruding, just making sure you were safe and well. I know about the hard winters when game was scarce, about the years when fur prices were too low to make ends meet. There were times I wanted to help, times I almost contacted you, but I was always afraid you'd think I was interfering or that you didn't want my help. Silas thought of the difficult years Thomas was referencing, the seasons when his trapping income had barely covered basic necessities, when he'd wondered if he was too proud to ask for help from anyone. He'd never known that Thomas was aware of his struggles, never suspected that help might have been available if he'd been willing to swallow his pride and reach out. I left you the cave in my will because I knew you'd explore it eventually, Thomas wrote. I knew Dusty would find the storage areas. That dog has been down here with me many times over the years, knows these passages better than I do. I hoped that when you found everything I'd preserved, you'd understand that I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping we could be brothers again. The mention of Dusty's familiarity with the cave system confirmed what Silas had suspected. His loyal dog had been keeping secrets too, had somehow formed a relationship with Thomas during visits to the cave that Silas had never known about. The thought of Thomas and Dusty sharing quiet moments in the underground chambers, perhaps talking about the brother who was too stubborn to visit, added another layer to the complex web of love and loyalty that had been operating around him. For years, I want you to use the mind's wealth wisely, the letter continued, not just for yourself, but for the community, for the land, for the things Dad and Grandpa cared about. There's enough money there to make a real difference in people's lives, to protect this mountain country from the developers who want to tear it apart for quick profits. Thomas had included specific suggestions for using the mine's wealth responsibly, establishing a foundation to help struggling ranch families, funding conservation efforts to protect the mountain ecosystems they'd both loved, providing scholarships for young people who wanted to stay in the area instead of leaving for the cities. But most of all, Thomas wrote, I want you to forgive me, not for my sake. I'll be gone by the time you read this, but for your own. I've carried the weight of our broken relationship for 40 years, and I don't want you to carry that burden for the rest of your life. I made mistakes, you made mistakes, but the love between us was never a mistake. The letter's final paragraph was the most difficult to read, written in handwriting that showed the extreme effort Thomas had expended on his farewell message. I'm going to be buried next to Mom and Dad in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery. I didn't want a big funeral. There aren't many people left who remember me anyway. But if you ever feel like visiting, I'd like that. I'd like to think that someday you might sit by my grave and tell me about your life, about the things we never got to share, about the conversations we never got to have. I'll be listening, brother. I'll always be listening. The signature was simply, your loving brother Thomas, followed by a postscript that made Silas's vision blur with unshed tears. P.S. Take care of Dusty. He's been a good friend to both of us. Silas folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking, with the intensity of emotions he'd kept buried for decades. Anger, grief, regret, and love crashed over him in waves, each feeling so powerful it threatened to overwhelm his ability to process what he'd learned. Thomas had died alone, but he'd died loving his brother. He'd lived in poverty while guarding. A fortune meant for both of them. He'd shouldered impossible burdens while dreaming of reconciliation that never came. He'd spent 40 years hoping for forgiveness while already having forgiven everything himself. The letter represented more than farewell. It was an act of grace, a final gift from a brother who had never stopped believing in the possibility of love conquering pride. But it was also a challenge, a call to action that would determine whether Silas spent his remaining years trapped in regret or liberated by forgiveness. In the silence of the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of his brother's devotion and sacrifice, Silas finally understood that the choice was his to make. He could remain trapped by 40 years of anger and pride, or he could honor Thomas's memory by choosing love, forgiveness, and the responsible stewardship of the legacy they should have shared. The childhood photograph fell from Thomas's wallet, like a leaf drifting to the ground, its edges worn soft from decades of handling. It was the same image Silas had found in the wooden crate, but this copy was different, smaller, creased from years of being carried in a back pocket, faded from being taken out, and looked at countless times over 4 decades of separation. 2 boys with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unconscious joy of brothers who believed their bond was unbreakable. Thomas had carried this image of them every single day for 40 years, through every argument with developers, every lonely Christmas, every moment when the burden of protecting their family's legacy had seemed too heavy to bear alone. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow, dropping him to his knees on the cold stone floor of the cave. The wallet had been in the pocket of Thomas's final clothes, the ones the funeral director had returned with his few personal effects. Somehow, in the mechanical process of handling his brother's death, Silas had overlooked this small leather repository of Thomas's most treasured possessions. Now, in the underground chamber surrounded by evidence of Thomas's lifelong devotion, the photograph's significance was overwhelming. While Silas had been working to forget their childhood bond, Thomas had been carrying it with him everywhere, a talisman against the loneliness of their estrangement. The emotional dam that had held for 40 years finally burst. Silas's grief came in waves that shook his entire body. 40 years of suppressed sorrow and regret pouring out in raw, ugly sobs that echoed off the stone walls. He wept for the brother he'd lost to pride and stubbornness. He wept for the decades of love that had been wasted in silence. He wept for Thomas dying alone while dreaming of reconciliation that would never come. Dusty moved closer, pressing his warm body against Silas's shaking form, offering the only comfort available in the depths of the mountain. The dog's presence was both solace and accusation, a reminder that loyalty and love didn't require grand gestures or perfect understanding, just consistent presence and unwavering devotion. "I'm sorry, Tommy," Silas whispered to the darkness, using the childhood nickname that no one had spoken in 40 years. "God, I'm so sorry. I should have come back. I should have swallowed my pride. I should have been there when you needed me." The words came in a torrent. All the conversations he should have had with Thomas, all the apologies that were 40 years too late. He spoke to the photograph, to the letters, to the empty spaces in the cave where his brother's presence still seemed to linger. "I was scared too," he admitted to the silence. "Scared of not being good enough, scared of depending on anyone, scared of being hurt again. But you kept loving me anyway, kept protecting me anyway, even when I didn't deserve it." The magnitude of Thomas's sacrifice became clearer with each passing moment. His brother had lived a life of deliberate limitation, choosing poverty over the wealth that might have attracted attention to their secret, choosing solitude over relationships that might have complicated his guardianship of the family legacy, choosing hope over bitterness, even when that hope seemed foolish. "You were the better man," Silas said, his voice breaking. "You were always the better man, and I was too proud to see it." He thought of all the times over the years when he'd driven past the hardware store where Thomas lived, slowing down but never stopping. He thought of the Christmas mornings when he'd wondered what Thomas was doing, whether he was alone, whether he ever thought about their childhood celebrations. He thought of the moments of triumph and failure when he'd instinctively wanted to share the news with someone who would understand its significance, only to remember that he'd cut himself off from the one person who would have cared most. Jack. Photograph trembled in his hands as he studied the faces of the two boys they'd been, innocent, trusting, certain that their brotherhood would last forever. Those boys had no idea that pride would prove stronger than love, that a single argument would stretch into decades of silence, that they would waste most of their adult lives on opposite sides of a divide that neither had really wanted to maintain. "I missed you every day," he whispered to Thomas's image. "I told myself I didn't, convinced myself I was better off alone. But I missed you every single day. I missed having someone who knew me before I learned to guard my heart. I missed having a brother." Dusty whined softly, a sound that somehow conveyed understanding and forgiveness. The dog had been witness to both brothers' loneliness, had somehow managed to bridge the gap between them even when they couldn't bridge it themselves. In his simple, loyal way, Dusty had been the keeper of secrets and the guardian of hope, waiting for the moment when truth could finally overcome pride. As his sobs gradually subsided, Silas felt something shifting inside his chest. Not healing, exactly, but the beginning of release. The anger that had sustained him for 40 years was dissolving, replaced by grief that was cleaner and more honest. Anger had been easier to carry than sorrow, but sorrow was the truer emotion, the one that honored the love that had been lost rather than the pride that had caused the loss. "I forgive you, Tommy," he said softly. "I forgive you for everything, and I hope, wherever you are, I hope you can forgive me too." The words seemed to echo in the chamber longer than physics would suggest, as if the mountain itself were acknowledging the significance of the moment. For the first time in 40 years, Silas felt truly connected to his brother, not through anger or resentment, but through the love that had never really died, only been buried under layers of pride and pain. In the photograph, the two boys continued, smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders, frozen in a moment of perfect brotherhood that had taken 40 years and a journey into the heart of the mountain to reclaim. Hidden beneath Thomas's final letter, wrapped in oiled cloth and nestled in the deepest corner of the document case, were two matching wooden crosses. They were carved from the same cherrywood as the box that had contained their childhood treasures, but these were clearly the work of adult hands, precise, beautiful, and bearing an inscription that made Silas's heart stop. On one cross, Silas Boone, beloved brother 1940, with the death date left blank, waiting. On the other, Thomas Boone, beloved brother 1943-2005, with the death date carefully filled in by the same hand that had carved the inscription. Thomas had made them both, had carved. Silas's cross, with the same loving attention he'd given his own, had somehow known or hoped that someday they would rest side by side as brothers should. The discovery was almost more than Silas could bear, evidence that even while dying alone, Thomas had been planning for their eventual reunion in death, if not in life. A note was attached to Silas's cross, written in Thomas's shakiest handwriting. "I made these after Dr. Morrison told me I didn't have long. I want to be buried with mine, and I hope someday yours will join it. We were meant to be together, Silas. We were always meant to be together." The wooden crosses represented everything their estrangement had cost them, a lifetime of shared experiences, mutual support through difficulties, the comfort of knowing someone in the world understood their history and loved them despite their flaws. But they also represented Thomas's unshakable faith that love was stronger than pride, that brotherhood transcended even death. Silas lifted his own cross, feeling its perfect weight in his palm, running his fingers over the careful carving that had been done by hands that were probably already trembling with illness. Thomas had spent some of his final days creating this symbol of eternal brotherhood, believing somehow that their bond would outlast the silence that had divided them in life. "I'll carry this," he promised the empty cave, speaking to Thomas's spirit or memory or whatever presence still lingered in the mountain where his brother had spent so many years protecting their family's legacy. "I'll carry it, and remember what we meant to each other before we forgot how to forgive." Dusty stood and moved toward the cave entrance, not urgently but with purpose, as if he understood that their underground journey was complete. The dog had guided them through the revelation of 40 years of hidden truth, had been the faithful messenger that finally delivered Thomas's love to the brother who needed to receive it. As Silas gathered the most important documents and artifacts, the photograph, the final letter, his cross, and the mining deed, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just inheriting wealth. He was inheriting Thomas's vision for their family's future, his careful stewardship of resources that could make a meaningful difference in the world. The mine represented more than money. It represented the dreams their grandfather had harbored, the hopes their father had carried, the sacrifices Thomas had made, and the opportunities Silas now had to honor all of them. The silver in the mountain could fund the foundation Thomas had envisioned, could protect the land their family had loved, could ensure that other families didn't suffer the kind of separation that had cost the Boone brothers 40 years of brotherhood. But first, he had a pilgrimage to make. Walking toward the cave entrance with Dusty beside him, Silas felt different than he had when they'd entered. The anger that had sustained him through decades of isolation was gone, replaced by something cleaner and more purposeful. He was no longer the bitter old trapper who had come to board up a worthless cave and forget the past. He was Thomas's, a brother inheritor not just of wealth but of love, keeper of memories and guardian of dreams that were too important to die with their dreamer. The afternoon sun seemed impossibly bright after hours in the mountain's depths, and Silas had to shade his eyes as they emerged from the cave entrance. But the light felt like blessing rather than assault, warm, welcoming, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when he'd entered the darkness. Sally stood patiently where he'd left her, and Dusty ran ahead to greet the horse with the enthusiasm of a dog who had important news to share. As Silas secured the precious documents in his saddlebags, he looked back at the cave entrance one final time. The opening no longer seemed forbidding or mysterious. It was simply the doorway to the place where his brother had preserved 40 years of love, waiting for the day when that love could finally be received and honored. Thomas's secret was safe now, not hidden, but transformed from burden into blessing, from shame into celebration of everything good that had survived their long estrangement. "Come on, boy," he said to Dusty, mounting Sally for the ride back to his cabin. "We've got work to do." But first, they had a stop to make at the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, where Thomas was waiting for his brother's first visit, and where two wooden crosses would finally be reunited after years of separation. The wooden sign at the cave entrance gleamed in the morning sunlight, its carefully carved letters spelling out Boone Family Memorial Cave and Nature Preserve, in the same precise script that had characterized all of Thomas's craftwork. 6 months had passed since Silas's discovery of his brother's 40-year legacy, and the transformation of both the cave and its inheritor was complete. The sign itself represented everything Silas had learned about love, sacrifice, and the power of forgiveness to reshape even the most broken relationships. He'd carved it himself, using the same cherrywood tools Thomas had left behind, working with the patience and attention to detail his brother had tried to teach him decades ago. Every letter had been a meditation on brotherhood, every stroke of the chisel an act of remembrance and redemption. Below the main inscription, in smaller but equally careful letters, were the words Thomas would have appreciated most. Established, in memory of Silas Boone, who taught his brother that love preserved is never truly lost. Dusty lay in the shade nearby, his muzzle now completely grey, but his eyes still bright with the contentment that comes from seeing important work completed. The old dog had been Silas's constant companion through the months of transformation, watching as his master evolved from a bitter, isolated man into someone capable of receiving and expressing the love that had been waiting 40 years to be acknowledged. The mind development had proceeded exactly as Thomas had envisioned, slowly, carefully, with environmental protections that ensured the mountain's beauty would be preserved for future generations. Small-scale extraction operations, managed by local workers and overseen by environmental scientists, generated enough income to fund the foundation Thomas had dreamed of, while leaving the vast majority of the silver untouched in the ground. The Boone Family Foundation had already begun making a difference in the lives of struggling ranch families throughout the region. Just last month, they'd helped the Henderson family avoid foreclosure on their property, provided college scholarships to 6 local students who wanted to study agriculture and environmental science, and funded a reforestation project that would restore areas damaged by previous mining operations. But the foundation's work was just one part of the legacy Silas had built from his brother's vision. The nature preserve surrounding the cave had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking solitude, reflection, and connection with the mountain wilderness that had shaped both Boone brothers. Hiking trails, marked but not intrusive, led visitors through the landscape Thomas had loved and protected, offering glimpses of the natural beauty that was worth more than any amount of silver extracted from the ground. The cave itself remained open for guided tours, but only in small groups, and only with careful attention to preserving both its natural features and its role as a memorial to Thomas's life and sacrifice. Visitors could see some of the artifacts. Thomas had preserved the photographs, the tools, the evidence of his careful stewardship, while learning about the importance of family, forgiveness, and environmental conservation. On a shelf near the cave entrance, protected by glass but visible to all visitors, sat two photographs. The first was the childhood image of the Boone brothers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the confidence of boys who believed their bond was unbreakable. The second was new, a recent photo of Silas and Dusty standing beside Thomas's grave, where the two wooden crosses now stood side by side, as Thomas had dreamed they would. Silas visited that grave every Sunday after church, a habit that would have surprised the man he'd been 6 months ago, but felt natural to the man he'd become. He brought flowers when they were in season, cleared away fallen leaves in autumn, and brushed snow from the crosses in winter. But mostly he brought conversation, updates on the Foundation's work, stories about the people they were helping, plans for protecting more of the mountain wilderness Thomas had loved. The Hendersons sent their thanks again, he'd told Thomas just last Sunday, speaking to the crosses as comfortably as if his brother were standing beside him. Their youngest boy got that scholarship to agricultural college, the one you would have liked. He wants to come back after graduation and help other families learn sustainable farming techniques. The conversations with Thomas had become one of the most meaningful aspects of Silas's transformed life. Speaking regularly with his brother's memory kept their relationship alive and growing, allowed for the sharing of experiences and dreams that 40 years of silence had made impossible. Death had ended their estrangement, but it hadn't ended their brotherhood. Letters arrived regularly from distant cousins and family members who had heard about the Foundation and the nature preserve. The Boone family, scattered across several states and largely out of touch for decades, was slowly reconnecting through the common thread of Thomas's legacy and Silas's stewardship of their shared heritage. Most meaningful was the letter from Mary Ellen Foster, Thomas's former wife, now remarried and living in Oregon. She'd heard about the Foundation through mutual friends and had written to share her memories of Thomas's kindness and his frequent mentions of the brother he missed terribly. "He talked about you often," she'd written. "Even during our marriage, I could tell that losing you was the great tragedy of his life. He never stopped hoping you'd reconcile, never stopped believing that the love between you was stronger than whatever had driven you apart. I'm so glad he was right." As Silas walked the preserve's trails in the late afternoon, checking on the reforestation projects and planning improvements for the following year, he often reflected on the lessons Thomas's life had taught him. Love could survive anything: silence, anger, pride, even death, if it was tended carefully and preserved with faith. Family bonds, however damaged, could be restored by forgiveness and understanding. And sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in the most unlikely packages, like fortune hidden in a worthless cave, or reconciliation discovered in the depths of grief. Dusty trotted beside him as they completed their daily circuit of the preserve, the old dog still eager for adventure despite his advancing years. They paused at their favorite overlook, where the mountain vista stretched for miles in every direction, showing the kind of natural beauty that Thomas had spent his life protecting. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded Silas of the warm glow from their father's pocket watch, still keeping perfect time in the place of honor on his mantle. Soon, the stars would emerge, the same constellations he and Thomas had studied as boys during their camping adventures, when the future seemed unlimited and brotherhood felt eternal. In many ways, Silas realized, those boys had been right. Brotherhood was eternal, if you knew where to look for it. It lived in preserved memories, in acts of sacrifice, in forgiveness offered and received, in legacies that honored love over pride. Thomas had taught him that love preserved was never truly lost. It was simply waiting in the darkness, ready to transform everything the moment someone was willing to light a candle and begin the journey home.